The first thing the German sentry hears is the music. It seeps across the cratered no-man's land in thin, ghostly threads, carried by the same night wind that lifts the reek of cordite and wet earth. Not a march, not the stiff brass of Kaiser's bands, but something looser, darker, with a rhythm that seems to roll in his chest. A clarinet laughs over a low, dirty trombone. Drums whisper like distant thunder. It is utterly out of place here between shattered trees and shell-torn parapets, and that is why it scares him. The second thing he hears is the rumor whispered along the German trench. They're out there, the Höllenkämpfer, Hellfighters. They say these men don't sleep. They say bullets don't drop them, and fire doesn't make them run. They say they're black devils from New York, that they paint their faces and creep through the wire with knives, that they fight like they have nothing to lose and nothing to go home to. German prisoners, shaken and pale, have muttered the same name. Harlem. The officers roll their eyes, but the men in the line listen. They remember the raids where the black soldiers did not give ground. They remember the patrols that went out and did not come back. A flare shivers into the sky, dripping green light over the blasted Argonne. In its brief glare, the sentry sees the world made of bone and wire. Then darkness slams down again, and with it the old fear. Somewhere beyond the twisted silhouettes of trees and the crouched forms of French and American troops, the Hellfighters wait, their bayonets fixed, their faces set. The irony is that when these same men first put on uniforms, their own army did not want to fight beside them at all. Back across the ocean, before they had a fearsome German nickname, before they became a line in enemy reports, they were simply the 15th New York National Guard Regiment, born in the crowded streets and tenements of Harlem. They came from barber shops and Pullman cars, from churches and pool halls and corner newspaper stands. Porters, elevator operators, musicians, dock workers, students. Harlem in the 1910s was a place of hustle and hope, a black neighborhood turning into the cultural capital of Black America, where writers and preachers talked of a new Negro who would demand rights, not just plead for them. When the United States entered the Great War in 1917, black leaders saw a grim opportunity. If African Americans bled for democracy abroad, perhaps they could finally claim it at home. Men like W.E.B. Du Bois urged black citizens to close ranks with white America, to put aside grievances and prove, once again, that patriotism ran as deep in Harlem as it did on Wall Street. Hundreds of black New Yorkers answered. The state of New York, under pressure from black activists and a few white allies, authorized a segregated regiment, the 15th New York Infantry. Colored. From the beginning, pride and insult walked hand in hand. The word colored in the regiment's designation was not a neutral label. It was a warning line, a reminder that these men would serve in a Jim Crow army, separate and unequal. Harlem's churches and civic clubs poured money and energy into the unit, organizing recruitment drives, hosting dances and rallies. Mothers sent their sons off with tears and hymns. In the armories, tailors pinned brass buttons onto crisp new uniforms, and men who had never before been allowed to vote now stood straight in formation, learning to salute the flag. But as they drilled, they heard the whispers, white officers doubting their intelligence, politicians warning that arming black men was dangerous, Southern newspapers predicting trouble. Colonel William Hayward, a white lawyer and politician, took command. He believed in his men fiercely, but he also understood the racial minefield they were marching into. He promised Harlem that the 15th would be a credit to the race and the city. Under his watch, they would fight the enemy abroad and prejudice at home. His challenge was to keep them from exploding under the daily friction of American racism before they ever saw a German trench. Their first real test came not in France, but in South Carolina. In October 1917, the regiment was ordered south to Camp Wadsworth, outside Spartanburg. The camp was designed to mimic the terrain of France, but the surrounding town reflected something much closer to home, the rigid, violent segregation of the Jim Crow South. Just weeks earlier, another black unit had been involved in a deadly uprising in Houston after relentless abuse by local police and civilians. White newspapers called it a mutiny. Black soldiers called it self-defense. 20 people had died. The whole country buzzed with tension. Into this powder keg marched 2,000 northern black soldiers, uniforms sharp, heads high, many of them unused to stepping off sidewalks or lowering their eyes for white strangers. Local whites saw them as an affront. They spat slurs and threats. Shopkeepers refused to serve black soldiers. Streetcars slowed to taunt them, then rattled away in clouds of dust. Rumors spread that a mob was forming, that the Ku Klux Klan was watching. Hayward knew how quickly a single incident could ignite another Houston. He gathered his men and issued an extraordinary order. No matter what is said, no matter what is done to you, you will not retaliate. You will report every insult, every shove, every denial of service to your officers. You will stand it. For now. This was not weakness, it was strategy. We will fight only one war at a time, he told them in effect. The first war would not be against white South Carolinians, it would be against the Kaiser. The men swallowed their rage. When Lieutenant James Reese Europe, the famed bandleader who would later bring jazz to France, was denied a newspaper at a Spartanburg shop, white soldiers of the 27th Division offered to defend him. Europe, wary of a riot that would doom his regiment, urged them to stand down and walk away. In back rooms and barracks, fists clenched, but discipline held. The tension grew so acute that the War Department quietly decided it was safer to remove the 15th from the South entirely. After just 2 weeks in Spartanburg, they were ordered north and then overseas. An entire regiment moved in part to prevent white citizens from provoking them into violence. They left Spartanburg without a lynching, without a riot, without a mutiny. That, too, was a battle won, but no medals would ever be pinned for it. Back in New York, other National Guard regiments marched off to war behind full bands and cheering crowds on Fifth Avenue. When the 15th shipped out at the end of December 1917, they did so largely without fanfare. There was no grand city-sponsored send-off. Racism had already dimmed the lights on their stage. On a cold ship packed with the smells of coal smoke, vomit, and nervous sweat, they crossed the Atlantic, the skyline of Manhattan sinking behind them. In their packs they carried letters from Harlem, small Bibles, photographs of mothers and sweethearts. In their heads they carried a simple hope that in France at least they would be allowed to fight. France greeted them not with trenches, but with shovels. They landed at Brest in early January 1918 and were assigned, like most black units, to the American Expeditionary Forces Services of Supply. Their days were spent unloading ships, laying railroad tracks, digging ditches, draining swamps, cleaning latrines, backbreaking labor vital to the war effort, but far from the glory of the front lines. White officers in high command, steeped in racist assumptions, doubted that black soldiers had the discipline or intelligence for combat. Let them move cargo, not assault German positions. Let them sweat, not bleed. For the men of the 15th, now redesignated the 369th Infantry Regiment, the insult cut deeper than any blisters. They had come across the ocean to prove themselves equal to any fighting man. Instead, they were treated like a pool of dark labor. In the mud of French ports, resentment grew. Colonel Hayward wrote letter after letter to headquarters, arguing that his regiment deserved a chance at the front. If allowed to fight, he insisted, they would show the world what black Americans could do. The French army, meanwhile, bled. By the spring of 1918, after nearly 4 years of war, France's divisions were hollowed out. Graveyards bloomed behind every village. The Germans had launched their last great offensives. The French and British clung to their lines by fingernails. They urgently needed fresh troops. But President Woodrow Wilson was determined that American soldiers would fight under an American flag, not be fed piecemeal into Allied units. General John J. Pershing, commanding the American Expeditionary Forces, generally agreed, except when politics and practicality collided. When the French begged for reinforcements, he made a choice that would change the fate of the Harlem Regiment. On April 8, 1918, the 369th Infantry Regiment was officially assigned to the French Army's 16th Division, 4th Army. They would fight under French command in French sectors, alongside French colonial troops from North and West Africa. In a quiet bureaucratic stroke, the U.S. Army had effectively loaned them out. As one later writer put it, Pershing placed the black orphan in a basket, set it on the doorstep of the French, rang the bell, and walked away. It felt to many like another rejection, but it was also a door opening. The first thing that changed was the gear. The Hellfighters kept their olive drab U.S. uniforms, the only Americans to do so on that sector of the line, but turned in their American weapons and equipment. The French issued them new leather belts and cartridge pouches, squat steel Adrian helmets painted horizon blue, gas masks that smelled of rubber and chemical cotton. In their hands, they now carried French Berthier rifles, slim bolt-action weapons that kicked hard into the shoulder, and bandoliers of 8mm Liebel cartridges. Their packs were filled with French rations, black bread that went hard as stone, tins of bully beef, onions, cheese, and sometimes a ration of thin red wine. The second thing that changed was how they were treated. French officers, many of them veterans of the brutal battles of Verdun and the Somme, were less obsessed with the color of a man's skin than with his willingness to hold a trench. France had long deployed black colonial troops from Senegal, Morocco, and Algeria. Racism certainly existed in French society, but on the front line, a soldier who could shoot and endure counted as a brother in arms. The 369th's men were saluted, drilled, and cursed at like any other soldiers. They ate with French troops. They marched through French villages where children ran beside them, fascinated by their dark faces and broad grins, calling out, "Bonjour, les Américains!" For many Hellfighters, it was the first time a white stranger had looked them in the eye without contempt. The French gave them a nickname, Les Hommes de Bronze, the men of bronze, for their toughness. The Germans, who would soon meet them in the shattered woods of Champagne and the Argonne, found another word, Hellfighters. At the same time, another weapon was being tuned and polished in the regiment, a sound, a rhythm, a new music that would echo far beyond the trenches. James Reese Europe had been a star in Harlem long before he put on a uniform. A composer, bandleader, and organizer, he had led orchestras at grand balls and cabarets, pushing syncopated rhythms and blues-inflected melodies into high society. When Hayward asked him to build a regimental band, Europe recruited some of the finest black musicians in New York. They carried their instruments through Spartanburg and across the Atlantic, trumpets nestled beside socks and shaving kits. In France, when they weren't training or working, they played. They played on docks and parade grounds, in battered town squares, in hospital wards where the band's hot clarinets and rattling drums lifted wounded men from morphine fog for a few precious minutes. French civilians had never heard anything like it. The marching bands of Europe were built on straight time and stiff brass. Europe's band swung. Their music rode on backbeats and offbeats. It turned marches into something that made feet go loose and hips want to move. French critics tried to find words, savage and modern, exotic and exhilarating, the sound of America. The band became a sensation, touring more than 2,000 miles across France, playing for troops of every flag, for generals and workers and children clapping in wooden shoes. Wherever they went, they carried the name of their regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters Band. But music could only delay the inevitable. In the spring of 1918, the 369 went up to the line. Their sector lay near the western edge of the Argonne forest, a tangle of blasted trees and churned fields. Trenches zigzagged like scars through the soil, their duckboards slick with water and slime. Rat tails rippled along the parapets. The air smelled of damp wool, unwashed bodies, chlorine gas that lingered in wooden beams, and the sharp metallic tang of old blood. Overhead, artillery rumbled day and night, a dull heartbeat that never fully stopped. The official record would later say that the Harlem Hellfighters spent 191 days in the trenches, more time under enemy fire than any other American unit. They would be engaged in the Champagne-Marne and Meuse-Argonne offensives, hold long stretches of front, and fight in assaults that chewed up entire battalions. Through it all, they would never lose a foot of ground to the enemy. No Hellfighter would ever be taken prisoner. On one particular night in May 1918, 2 of them were ordered forward to a lonely outpost. Private Henry Johnson was just 20-something, a compact man from Albany with a job as a railroad porter before the war. He stood barely 5'4" and weighed around 130 pounds, but what he lacked in size, he made up for in nerve. Beside him was Private Needham Roberts, younger, from Trenton, New Jersey. The French had taught them enough phrases to understand basic commands. They wore French helmets and carried French grenades and Berthier rifles. That night, they were assigned to Outpost 20, a little hump of earth and sandbags pushed out in front of the main line, linked by a narrow duckboard-lined communication trench. Their job was simple and terrifying. Listen, watch, and be the early warning if the Germans tried something. It was just after midnight when they took their positions. The sky was a low lid of cloud, blotting out the stars. Somewhere behind them, far down the trench, a French soldier hummed a snatch of tune he'd caught from Europe's band, the melody drifting faint and lost. Johnson and Roberts settled in behind their sandbags, rifles laid on the parapet, eyes straining at the darkness that seemed to move and breathe by itself. Hours passed, measured in the slow drip of water from the trench wall, the distant cough of a machine gun, the occasional whine of a stray shell far overhead. The cold worked its way through their boots and up their legs. Fingers numbed around rifle stocks. They spoke in low murmurs about home. Albany, Trenton, Harlem's streets they had passed through on the way to camp, voices swallowed by the night. Then Johnson heard it, a tiny metallic snip. He froze. There it was again. Snip, not like a twig breaking or a rat scratching, a set of metal teeth biting through wire. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Roberts nodded, every nerve on edge. Barbed wire lay in front of their outpost, coiling in the dark like a dead, twisted thing. The Germans, out there somewhere in the black, were cutting it. Johnson's skin prickled. The French had warned them. A wire-cutting sound at night almost always meant a raiding party. He groped for one of his French grenades, feeling the smooth, egg-shaped body in his palm. With fingers that suddenly felt too big, he pulled the pin and lobbed it toward the sound, counting the heartbeats before it burst. The explosion tore open the night, a vicious flash and a roar that shook the post. Shouts erupted in German. The raid was on. More grenades arced in from the darkness, heavy thumps in the mud, bursts of flame and shrapnel that clawed at sandbags and splintered duckboards. One detonated close enough to slam Roberts off his feet, filling the air with mud and splinters. He cried out as metal tore into his arm and hip, a hot, searing pain that made his leg fold under him. Johnson felt shards of wood and stone bite into his own skin, but he stayed upright, working the bolt of his rifle and firing into the vague shapes emerging through the smoke. The Germans had chosen their moment well. At least a dozen, perhaps as many as 25 soldiers were driving forward, some with grenades, some with rifles and bayonets fixed. Their boots splashed in puddles, their voices barked sharp commands. Shots cracked, muzzle flashes stabbing the murk. Johnson fired again and again, the rifle kicking his shoulder, the muzzle flash destroying his night vision with each shot. He heard Roberts groan behind him, tried to shout for him to get back, then felt the sick, hollow click of an empty magazine. He reached for another, fumbling at his belt. In that instant, a German bullet smashed into his hand, mangling fingers and sending the spare clip spinning into the mud. Another round ripped into his arm. Pain flared white, and the rifle slipped from his grasp, clattering to the duckboards. For a moment, everything narrowed. The burn of his wounds, the taste of blood and cordite in his mouth, the knowledge that the enemy was still coming. Retreat was impossible. There was nowhere to go. Behind them was the trench. Behind that, the line that could not be breached. If the Germans overran this outpost and punched through, they might drag back prisoners for interrogation and propaganda, pry open a weak spot in the French defenses. Johnson's world reduced itself to a decision: stand or die. He grabbed his rifle again, not as a firearm but as a club, swinging it into the first shape that loomed over the sandbags. Wood met bone with a crunch. A German went down. Another scrambled forward, bayonet lunging. Johnson twisted, the blade scraping his gear. He brought the rifle down on the man's head, again and again, until he stopped moving. Then his rifle jammed. Whether the bolt seized or the barrel bent from the savage blows, it no longer mattered. The weapon was dead weight. Johnson dropped it and reached for the heavy bolo knife hanging at his side, a wicked machete-like blade issued for cutting brush and, in desperate moments, throats. Its handle fit his palm like something he'd been born with. He hurled himself at the next German, slashing in short, brutal strokes. Warmth splashed his face, his hands. A man screamed high and thin, then gurgled into silence. All around him the night became a whirl of bodies and shadows, steel on steel, boots slipping on blood-slick boards. He fought like a man possessed, like every insult he'd ever swallowed in America had been welded into his arm. The Germans had expected easy prey, 2 isolated sentries to be knocked aside. Instead, they had found a storm. Roberts, bleeding heavily, propped himself up against the trench wall and began throwing grenades with his good arm, pitching them toward the sound of German boots. Each detonation ripped holes in the raiding party, sowing confusion. Shrapnel chewed deeper into his own flesh, but he kept going, teeth gritted, the world reduced to the arc of his arm and the blasts that shook the ground. At some point in the chaos, German soldiers reached Roberts. Half-conscious, he felt rough hands grab him, tugging him over the sandbags. The enemy wanted a prisoner, someone to interrogate, parade, use in leaflets. Roberts tried to twist away, but his wounds betrayed him. He slid helplessly, boots scraping. Johnson saw it happen, saw his comrade being dragged into the darkness like a sack. Something inside him snapped. With a roar that cut through the gunfire, he charged. Bullets punched into him, into his side, his back, his feet. Later, doctors would count 21 separate wounds. In that moment, he barely felt them. Knife flashing, he fell on the Germans, hauling Roberts away, hacking and stabbing until they dropped the wounded man and turned their fury on this small, unstoppable figure, cutting them down in the mud. It could not last forever. No single man can fight off a squad indefinitely. But he didn't have to defeat them. He only had to break their nerve. There is a point in every raid when calculation takes over from momentum. The Germans had expected surprise. Instead, despite their grenades and numbers, they faced a defender who refused to fall, who fought with a primal ferocity that turned close quarters into slaughter. Men shouted in panic. Someone called for retreat. Perhaps they feared that the noise had already summoned French reinforcements. Perhaps they simply had no stomach left for this kind of hell. One by one, they melted back into the darkness, some wounded, some dragging their dead, leaving a slick of blood and shredded gear behind. Johnson, breathing in ragged gasps, leaned against the sandbags, the bolo knife heavy and wet in his hand. Roberts lay moaning nearby. The outpost was a wreck of splintered wood and churned earth, but it still stood. Neither man had left his post. No German had passed through. When French troops finally reached them, drawn by the noise, they found an unimaginable scene. 2 black American soldiers torn by wounds, surrounded by evidence of the fight. Spent shells, shattered grenades, blood trails leading away into the dark. It was estimated that Johnson had killed at least 4 Germans and wounded many more. He had single-handedly prevented Roberts's capture. News of the exploit raced along the French lines and back to Paris. The French government awarded both Johnson and Roberts the Croix de Guerre, one of its highest honors, making them among the first Americans of any race to receive it. Johnson's medal bore a palm for extraordinary valor, the citation describing him as a man of magnificent courage and energy. French soldiers gave him another name, Le Tigre, while American newspapers, briefly forgetting their usual condescension, dubbed him Black Death. Back in Harlem, the story exploded across headlines. For a moment, the nation saw what a black soldier could be when the shackles of second-class status were lifted. Not a beast or a servant, but a warrior whose courage shamed men who had tried to keep him from the front. Johnson and Roberts were only 2 men in a regiment of thousands, but their night at Outpost 20 became a symbol of what the Harlem Hellfighters were doing every day along the Western Front. The war ground on. The 369th held line after line, their days a tightening loop of routine and terror. At dawn, gray light would reveal the corpses caught in the wire, the fractures in the parapet. Men stood to, rifles ready, fingers stiff with cold. Sentries scanned the horizon for the telltale puff of artillery or the creeping belly of gas. When orders came, Hellfighters went over the top, boots squelching in mud, their horizon blue helmets bobbing beside French comrades as they advanced into curtains of fire. In Champagne, and later in the Meuse-Argonne, they pushed forward through fields cratered like the moon, through villages ground to powder. They lost men to machine guns, to shell bursts, to gas that clawed their lungs raw. In one brutal engagement, a French general, seeing the ferocity of German fire, suggested that Colonel Hayward pull his men back. Hayward, whose pride in his regiment had by now hardened into something like stubborn faith, is reported to have replied, "My men never retire. They go forward or they die." It was not entirely true. Not every attack could be pressed home, but as an ethos, it fit the unit. Over those 191 days of combat, the Hellfighters would never be driven from a position they had taken. German commanders learned the pattern. Where the dark American troops held, raids failed. Where they advanced, they kept coming. Their bravery came at a terrible cost. Around 1,500 Hellfighters were killed or wounded, among the highest casualty counts for any American regiment in the war. At war's end, 171 members of the 369th received individual Croix de Guerre or other French decorations. The entire regiment was awarded a collective Croix de Guerre for its service. Many soldiers also earned U.S. Distinguished Service Crosses, though the tide of recognition back home never fully matched what the French bestowed. Through it all, whenever they were rotated even for a few days into reserve towns behind the line, the band played. Sometimes they played in muddy courtyards, brass polished as best they could manage, uniforms stained with trench dirt. Sometimes they played in cramped hospitals, standing at the foot of beds where men with missing limbs tried to tap phantom toes to the beat. Sometimes they marched through liberated villages, horns blazing, as women threw flowers from shattered windows. Europe arranged pieces that blended military marches with the syncopation of ragtime and the soul of black spirituals. One of his most famous numbers, On Patrol in No Man's Land, put words and music to the Hellfighters' experience. The crash of shells, the rattle of machine guns, the creeping dread of the dark. Even when men could not speak of what they'd seen, they could nod along as the band gave it shape. For the French, this was their first sustained encounter with jazz and its forerunners. In cafes and concert halls, Europe's band left audiences stunned and thrilled. Officers wrote glowing reports, civilians clamored for more performances. Long after the guns fell silent, French musicians would remember the shock of those rhythms, the sense that a new century had arrived with a backbeat. The Harlem Hellfighters were fighting one war in trenches and another in the realm of culture, and in both they were advancing the lines. At last, in November 1918, the cannons began to fall quiet. On the 11th day of the 11th month, at the 11th hour, an armistice took effect. Along the Hellfighters sector, men climbed cautiously from their trenches to stand in the raw air and listen to the unnatural stillness. No machine gun chatter, no whine of shells, just coughs, murmured prayers, the creak of leather gear. Some wept openly, tears cutting pale tracks through trench grime. Others simply stared, unsure what to do with the sudden absence of death. They had done what they came to France to do. They had fought, they had held, they had proven, beyond question, that black soldiers could stand in the very worst of modern combat and not break. But the war's end did not mean the end of their journey. they still had to go home. In February 1919, a ship carrying the men of the 369th slid into New York Harbor. This time, the city did not look away. On February 17th, the Harlem Hellfighters marched in a massive victory parade. Nearly 3,000 men assembled in full kit at the southern tip of Manhattan. The winter air bit at their faces, but the sun caught the medals on their chests. Croix de Guerre, ribbons, burnished bronze, silver stars. At their head marched James Reese Europe and his band, instruments gleaming. When they struck up a tune, the sound bounced between stone buildings and up into the cold blue sky. They stepped off up Fifth Avenue, boots drumming on the pavement. White and black New Yorkers alike packed the sidewalks 10 deep. Office workers leaned out of windows, confetti fluttering around them. Black schoolchildren had been dismissed from class so they could see the men who had carried the name of Harlem across the Atlantic and into the teeth of German guns. Parents lifted their kids onto shoulders, pointing at the regimental colors rippling above the ranks. Old men who remembered the Civil War raised trembling hands in salute. The Hellfighters marched in perfect lines, formation tight, eyes straight ahead. They had come home not as anonymous stevedores or cooks, but as heroes of the Republic, bearing honors that Europe had not hesitated to give. As they passed the reviewing stand, dignitaries bowed and clapped. Newspapers called it a day of glory for Harlem. Then the column turned north, leaving behind the skyscrapers and brokerage houses, entering streets that grew more familiar. When they reached Harlem, a roar went up, a specific, almost desperate joy. This was their neighborhood. These were their people. Women in Sunday hats waved handkerchiefs. Men shouted names as they recognized brothers, cousins, neighbors. Europe's band, knowing exactly where they were, slid into tunes the community knew by heart. For a few miles, New York felt like a city where black courage was finally acknowledged. For a few miles, it was possible to believe that the world had changed. Then the parade ended. The uniforms were folded away. Medals were placed in drawers. And America, which had been willing to celebrate black soldiers in a brief surge of post-war euphoria, reverted with chilling speed to its old habits. Across the country in 1919, white mobs turned their anger and fear on black communities. Economic tensions, competition for jobs and housing, resentment of black veterans who dared to wear their uniforms proudly in public, all of it ignited into violence in what would be called the Red Summer. In more than 36 cities and counties, from Washington, D.C. and Chicago to Elaine, Arkansas, white gangs attacked black neighborhoods, looting, burning, lynching. Hundreds of black Americans were killed. Thousands were injured or left homeless. Many of the targets were veterans, men who had returned from the trenches with a new sense of dignity and unwillingness to be cowed. They wore their uniforms like armor, their medals like arguments. Some organized self-defense, refusing to let mobs do to their families what the Germans had not done to them. For white supremacists, this assertiveness was intolerable. The same black men who had been good enough to face German machine guns were now seen as a threat for daring to expect full citizenship. The streets of American cities became, for a season, a new kind of battleground. The men of the 369 were not immune. They came home to segregated neighborhoods, to white-only signs, to employers who preferred to hire white veterans first. Banks didn't care about a croix de guerre when denying loans. City governments did not redraw housing lines just because black soldiers had marched up Fifth Avenue. Some Hellfighters found work, married, raised families. Others struggled with invisible wounds, with injuries that made physical labor impossible. Henry Johnson, the hero of Outpost 20, discovered that his 21 combat wounds had ended his career as a porter. Despite his fame, he found little steady support. He spoke bluntly about racism in America, and the spotlight turned away. He died in 1929, poor and largely forgotten, buried in a segregated cemetery under a simple marker. Only many decades later would the United States posthumously award him the Purple Heart, then the Distinguished Service Cross, and finally, in 2015, the Medal of Honor he had earned in that desperate night fight. James Reese, Europe's story was likewise bittersweet. After the triumph of the parade, he and his band began a national tour, bringing the music they had honed in France back to American audiences. Jazz, that unruly child of black creativity, was on the cusp of remaking popular music. Europe stood at its forefront. But in May 1919, during a dispute on the road, his own drummer stabbed him in the neck. He died of his wounds at 38, his coffin draped in the flag of a country that still did not fully claim him. His funeral in New York drew thousands, another procession of grief and admiration marching through Harlem's streets. The regiment itself would endure, in different forms, through later wars and into the modern National Guard. The nickname Harlem Hellfighters, once an unofficial label dreamed up by terrified enemies and proud allies, would finally be recognized formally by the U.S. Army a century later. The men who had slogged through Champagne mud and Argonne muck would, long after their deaths, receive collective honors like the Congressional Gold Medal, belated acknowledgments that their valor had been real and extraordinary, even if their own country had tried to ignore it at the time. Yet the most enduring part of their legacy isn't written just in decorations or official designations. It lives in the stories that still circulate, in the images of black soldiers standing at attention in mismatched uniforms and French helmets, in the blurred photographs of a band playing jazz in muddy fields, in the memory of a small man from Albany who stood in a forward post and refused to let the enemy take his brother. Imagine for a moment that original German sentry again, huddled in his trench as rumors of the Hellfighters move along the line. He doesn't know their names, he doesn't know Harlem from Houston. He knows only that somewhere in the dark are men who, when cornered, will fight with rifle butts and knives and bare hands, rather than yield an inch. He has heard that they have been in the line longer than any other Americans, that they do not break, that they do not surrender prisoners. Maybe he has heard, faintly, the strange new music they play behind the front, the rhythm that makes the world feel unsteady. All of it wraps itself into one emotion: fear. On the other side of no man's land, a hellfighter stands his own watch. The mud sucks at his boots. His fingers are numb around the stock of a rifle the American Army did not want him to carry. He remembers Spartanburg and the men who spat on him. He remembers the long slog with freight on the docks of Brest. He remembers the first time a French child looked up at him with pure curiosity, not hate. He thinks about Harlem, the crowded streets, the music, the laughter, the church bells, the promises whispered by leaders who said that service would change things. He cannot yet know that when he returns, if he returns, he will march beneath showering confetti and then walk straight back into a country convulsed by racist terror. He doesn't know that history will take almost a century to say his name with the respect it deserves. All he knows is the weight of the rifle, the shape of the knife at his hip, the feel of the trench wall at his back, and the presence of the man beside him who depends on him. Between them, stretched across an ocean and a century, is the story of the Harlem Hellfighters, men who fought like hell for a country that treated them like dirt, who carved their honor into the mud of foreign fields, who brought home not just victory, but a new sound, a new pride, a new claim to American identity. The music they played in those fields has never fully stopped. It echoes in Harlem clubs, in Paris basements, in the backbone of jazz and the broader rhythm of black resistance. The line they held in Champagne and the Argonne runs forward through Selma and Birmingham, through marches where veterans of other wars wore their medals as they faced police batons. The courage they showed under French skies helped build the foundation on which later generations would stand and say, with increasing force, that the promises of democracy belong to them too. Somewhere in the darkness of the Argonne, the night watch goes on. A flare rises, bright and brief, lighting the scarred earth. In that cold, pale light, you can see them, silhouettes of black soldiers in French helmets, standing in a trench that smells of mud and smoke, their faces set, eyes sharp, ready to meet whatever comes. For a century, history dimmed that flare, let the light die quickly. Now, slowly, it is being allowed to burn a little longer, so that we can all see more clearly the men the Germans once called Höhlenkämpfer, and whom we can finally, properly, call heroes.